Hello, good day, and welcome to another edition of Dojo Live. This is Ram Ganesan, your co-host. I'm from Northern New Jersey, and I'm joined by Tulio Siragusa from Los Angeles, California. And also from California in the East Bay, Lafayette, we have Steve Andrews, the president and CEO of the Western Bankers Association, as our guest for today's segment. And we will be talking about headwinds facing the banking industry. What does the future hold? Welcome, Steve, to Dojo Live.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ram.
That's great too, and we're very glad to have you here, and looking forward to the next 30 minutes of finding out more about Steve and about the Western Bankers Association. So why don't we start with an easy one? Steve, why don't you just give the audience and us a little bit of background about yourself, and let us get to know you better.
Sure. So I guess historically, I've been in the financial services industry most of my life, and I've run four banks. I've started banks. I guess I've scaled banks, and I've actually liquidated banks. And so I've been on platforms of four small community banks historically. And then for background, also, I've had sort of an association affiliation where I've volunteered time both at the federal level and state level. And so currently that's my gig. I'm running a state banking association.
Cool.
That's great. So what interested you in banking? Was it just something that you chose from the time you went to grammar school, or how did you get into banking?
I think I actually fell into banking. When I put myself through college, I was in the sort of the food industry, so to speak, and I ran bars. I was a night bar manager, and that gave me the ability to make a lot of quick dough, quit and travel. And when it came time for graduation, I think I was going to migrate toward retail industry because as a bartender, you're kind of outgoing. But I sort of fell into banking, interviewing with Bank of America. And I've enjoyed a great ride. I've run four banks. I've testified in front of Congress. I've traveled to China as an ambassador for the industry. So I think it's been a great career for me.
Definitely a pillar of our whole financial and the economic backbone of the country. So I can imagine some of the criticality of the work that you've done, especially if it required testifying in front of Congress, from bars to banks, right? So seems like an interesting ride. So tell us a little about that.
Sounds like a good book. Sounds like a good book. I got into fintech early in my career because I just wanted to wear the cool ties. Because it's the only industry that required ties. So, but it looks like it's dropped the ties. So anyway, go ahead. Yeah. That's a good book. Bars to Banking. Good. I'm sorry.
So Steve, tell us a little about that testification. I don't know if that's the right word, but testimony in front of Congress. What was that about?
Yeah, so I've probably done that a handful of times. And typically, when you're in trade associations, you're in an advocacy position. And so you're testifying on different subject matters. And so I've been doing that at the state level and also the federal level. Most of my testimony came during the financial meltdown. But I testified concerning regulatory overreach before. And so I was involved with Barney Frank's committee and testified on really what was happening to the small banks during the big meltdown. I've testified against Walmart before when they were trying to get into banking, both at the state of California, at the federal level in front of the FDIC. I've testified on small business. And so it's kind of a rush. When you're up there, sometimes you've got people that don't agree with you, and you have to be on your toes. But it's fun, and I've testified in front of capital markets too when they're trying to change around sort of the way we do mortgages. So it's been fun.
Got it. Sounds definitely interesting. So from there to Western.
And scary.
Scary.
Well, it's a rush. I mean, you're definitely scared when you're waiting to go on, and then cameras zoom in on you, and so it's kind of showtime. And you have both friends and foes maybe in the audience. Some people that may believe in your position, some people that maybe don't. The scary part is, do you have enough knowledge? Are they going to ask you a question that maybe you can't handle, or are they going to grandstand and try and make a point? And you don't control that process typically, so it's a little bit of a rush. I mean, it's different, but I enjoy it.
Live on C-SPAN, huh?
There you go.
So yeah, this is not your first rodeo. That's great. So tell us a little about the journey to Western Bankers Association. How did that come to be? Would love to hear more about what your organization does and what's your message for people like us.
Well, I think in any industry, there's some people that volunteer on behalf of the industry, and so I would put myself into that group. So as I mentioned earlier, I've run 4 small platform banks, and during that time, I volunteered, I guess, for trade associations, both at the state level and the federal level. And associations, what they do is just aggregate a bunch of voices and they amplify a position. And so I volunteered quite a bit, both in California and then the national level through the Independent Community Bankers of America, and ended up on a bunch of boards. And after kind of 4 gigs with running banks, I was trying to figure out what to do: retire, continue to work, jump into fintech. And this gig at the Western Bankers Association came up, and I really checked a lot of the boxes for them. I think that, I've been an industry advocate for a while. I've testified. I've been involved with education because I taught up at the Pacific Coast Banking School. And so, I got considered along with a pool of a bunch of other probably great candidates and was lucky enough to get picked. And so now I represent the industry as the Western Bankers Association mouthpiece, so to speak.
That's great. So are there similar for other parts of the country? Is there specific states or regions that you're focused on?
Yeah, so we did a merger a couple of years back with the Western Independent Bankers Association, and they were a trade association geared toward education. And we were the California Bankers Association, probably the largest state trade association west of the Mississippi. Well, Texas is probably larger, but for the most part, a big player. And now we have a 13-state footprint, and you'll find an association in virtually every state in the United States. And so we represent California for advocacy. We also represent at the federal level to a degree. And then our education sort of spans the entire Western region, if you will. So we're in 13 states and a couple of the, territories.
Okay, that's great. In terms of the work that you do, is it primarily focusing more on regulatory bodies and representing the banking industry, or is it more of educating the banking industry themselves or bankers themselves about what the changes are in the rules, or what is your typical day in the life in Western Bankers Association?
I guess I would answer that there's 2 broad missions. One is to advocate, and the other is really to educate. And so I think that most banks will join for the advocacy to a large degree, although they do like the education as well. And so what we try and do, again, is amplify the voices. You're hanging out in New Jersey, but California is a very liberal state, very progressive. It's maybe the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. And so a lot of things that go on in California tend to flow north and then also east. And that's the same for legislation. And so, the legislature is not always educated in financial services, but then they're jumping in and trying to regulate it. So our role is to really educate legislators about unintended consequences of some of their actions relative to financial services. We look at maybe 2,000 bills a year in California, see what touches sort of the financial arena. And then we're out there educating legislators when they're starting to put together some of their laws. And, their laws are, they're detrimental sometimes to certain industries. So we're just pointing that out. And that's kind of our primary role. So we'll be out there and we'll educate them. And then we'll educate bankers as well. And so, for example, yesterday we were sort of pushing back on public banks and thinking it's not such a great idea. That, you've got a bunch of banks that are already available to serve the low to moderate income people. State of California was struggling just to get money out the door to its people that were unemployed. And by the way, it lost $11 billion in the process. Now, why do you think you would run a more efficient bank? So those are the kind of conversations we have with legislators.
$11 billion. That doesn't sound like pocket change for sure.
No, 11 billion is not.
I just learned what the legislators are doing all year round. They're putting out 2,000 bills. There's it's a big state. I mean, when you go through the Western United States, they've got professional legislatures, which we have, but then you've got volunteer. You can go just north to Oregon, and it's a volunteer legislature. And so, there's a lot of issues that these states grapple with: water, privacy, all sorts of things. But in finance, California tends to try and lead the way, and we just want to make sure that we're protecting franchise values for the people in financial services. And that's our membership. They come in, and we have 3 professional lobbyists on staff, and they do a heck of a job. And we just go out there and advocate on behalf of our membership. And then we also do a lot of education. So, we've got a Women in Banking conference coming up in just about 4 or 5 days, and we'll probably get 400 people attending that. And we'll show them economists, we'll show them leadership, we'll show them all sorts of stuff. And so it's a fun job.
Great. So going back to the topic that we're going to talk about today, headwinds facing the banking industry. What does the future hold? So what are the headwinds, and are they precipitated by the ongoing global pandemic, et cetera, or is this more systemic and larger than that?
It's all of that. So I guess, if we were to take a look at headwinds facing the banks today, I think one of the biggest headwinds facing banks is a compressed operating margin or net interest margin. And so I've been at this industry for a lot of years. And, if we were to look back maybe to 1985, there are probably roughly 20,000 bank franchises in the US. Today, there's 5,000. And so there's a lot of consolidation. And so what's driving consolidation? Well, part of it's technology, part of it's operating costs with all the laws that are out there that you have to comply with. It's a tough business. It's very heavily regulated with very, very razor thin margins. And so you said, hey, is the pandemic affecting it? Well, it is. If you think about the pandemic, what happened maybe a year ago is the Fed got together over the weekend in an emergency session and said, holy moly, we got this thing heading to our shores. Let's drop the rates. And so they dropped the rates by 50 basis points in an emergency meeting over a weekend. And that just compresses the ability of a bank to make money. And so when I was running banks, the net interest margins were 500 basis points. Today, they're maybe in the low 2s or high 2s or maybe 3. And so that compression, it really inhibits the ability to make money. So that's a big driver. And then if you think about what the recession brought, it just crushed businesses all around the country. And who lends those businesses? Well, the banks do. And so on one hand, some of the businesses are getting bailed out, but on the other hand, a lot of them are going to fail. And if the banks are financing that, they're going to take some heavy losses. And so, it's a tough business. And like any other business, margins get compressed and compressed and compressed. Things get cheaper and cheaper. And so I think that that's the immediate headwind. And then I think the long haul is, what will the industry look like down the road? To what extent will payments change with blockchain technology? To what extent will ledgers, become more prevalent? To what extent will we see success with cryptocurrency and things of this nature? And so, when you start thinking really big, financial services is really changing before our eyes, and some people see that and others don't.
Yeah, there's two or three themes that you clearly touched upon here. One of them is the whole digitization of this banking industry. And the second one that I caught was the pandemic, in terms of, how it upended the interest rates and reduced margins even more, and then created this whole systemic reset of lending, and banks are in front and center there, right? Both in terms of bad loans as well as disbursing PPA loans and what have you. So there's some good and then some bad there. And then the third one, which is becoming more and more a relevant topic, it used to be just a hobby not too long ago, is cryptocurrency.
Right.
It's become mainstream in the last 12 to 18 months, and it's been on the uptick for a significant period now through the last year and more and counting. So would love to touch on each of these areas. So let's start with the digitization of the banking industry. How is that affecting? Do you consider that to be a good thing or a bad thing for the banking industry?
Well, I think financial evolution and change is always a good thing. It's painful for those that can't adopt or be flexible or nimble. And so,
Well said.
I think bankers are both embracing it, and then they're also maybe a little fearful of some of the change. But if you think, like, 2 days ago, Visa came out and said it's going to accept Bitcoin. So who owns Visa? Well, banks own Visa. And so you start thinking about some of those major trends. A big company like that does not lend its flag or its logo lightly. And so when they step in and they kind of endorse it, that's pretty big. And then you think about JP Morgan Chase, where, 3 or 4 years ago, hey, this stuff is maybe voodoo. And then today they have their own JPM coin, and they're using it only between their biggest customers back and forth. That's pretty big stuff. When you think about Libra and Facebook coming out, and they were behind the coin before they ran into sort of a lot of bad press, and then they've recently rebranded. They're trying to develop a new currency. And so there are these humongous trends under the surface that they're just gaining traction. So the issue is, how quickly do they gain traction, and where does it all end up? But I think there's going to be some major sea changes. And I think that the governments need to wake up, because if you're in the US and you're the reserve currency today, you don't want to lose that status. And so how do you play in that ball game? So there's some interesting conversations that are transpiring about how do we consider digital currency? What do we do with stable coins that are backed by currency? How do we handle anti-money laundering issues? If we're too tough, do we give up our perch and China grabs it? Or, what happens if there's a different type of reserve currency in the future? What's that do with all of our debt? Interesting things to think about.
Steve, I'm curious. Obviously, there's a lot of disruption happening in the banking industry from new players, more nimble, faster, digitized. Perhaps because they are not so tied into the similar regulations that a lot of the big banks have, and perhaps because new consumers want something faster and different. How are these two things colliding with banking, and what are they doing about it? Are they thinking about perhaps decentralizing a little bit back to having more flexibility? Because isn't some of the issues, you can't do this in one part of the bank, you can't do that in the other part of the bank because you own this piece of business. So it becomes very convoluted and challenging to be a bank today versus these new players who don't have those same challenges. So how are they working through that, even considering that the regulations are still there? Any advice of how some of these banks can get ahead of this?
Well, I think that it's what's interesting about, let's just take a slice of that question off and talk about cryptocurrencies for a second. The major one is obviously Bitcoin, and that's either going to go to $1 million or it's going to go to zero. And so why is it racing? Well, maybe it's racing because last year we printed as much as 25% of all the dollars that ever been printed were printed last year by the Fed. 25%. That's a big number. And so, is it kind of a digital gold? Will it ever see the transaction that it originally thought it might, as far as instantaneous, go pick up your cup of coffee at the local coffee dispensary? And so it's in its infant stages to a degree. So there's still fraud, there's still issues around anti-money laundering, there's all these. And it's easy to say no now, but people said no to TV, people said no to ATMs, people said no to adopting the internet. But they're going to get it figured out. And so where we are now is that this is coming. It's just a matter of when, and then how does it get regulated? And you're just starting to see institutional players for the first time step into that area. And I think what's happening is that there's a push and a shove geared toward the folks that originally anticipated as, keep the government out, versus the real money that doesn't want to play until there's a certain level of regulation. And that's what's happening now, is how do you create certainty for the investor? And so if it's a small time investor and no one's jumping in, then the industry doesn't take off. But when the real money comes off the sidelines institutionally, they're looking for the same safety guards and guardrails that are in banking. And so that's kind of what's happening in that industry to a degree. And what's going to happen in banking is you're going to continue to see the largest banks be able to innovate and play, and the smallest banks have trouble because they don't have the infrastructure. And so that drives a little bit of the consolidation with our industry. And then where do we end up with this? Right now, you've got money, as we speak, flying around the world. When we ran into this crisis, what did we do? Well, we went back and we just created a bunch of money. And so it'll be interesting to see where it all shakes out. But blockchain is going to play a big role. You can take a look at the payment system today. So if we're sitting here in California, we want to send money overseas. Maybe if we use the wire system, it takes a day and a half to get there. You can do that in blockchain almost instantaneously. You can send money across borders. They do that settlement today. So you could take a look at the Ripple coin that got in trouble, but was being used by some big banks like Standard. They can send money and it can be there almost instantaneously. Chase is
so no more
its biggest customers.
So that's going to just revolutionize the whole transfer of money and fiat across borders, right? And regulating that will become more private or democratized as opposed to governments and, I guess, intermediary banks.
Well, I mean, the beauty of that is it's speed, but it's also transparency. You don't just get the instantaneous without the transparency, which is why people really like it. So it's self-governed versus regulated from
to a degree,
right?
but then,
I mean, is that the draw, right? I mean, I'm thinking that could be the big sort of a attraction right now, but you're saying eventually for the big money to come to play with this, there's going to have to be some regulation to protect those investors. Is that what we're hearing?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, let's say that you're upset today with Bitcoin. Where do you go? Is there a CEO?
Right.
You know, and so you start taking a look at some of these tokens that are traveling across a blockchain or Ethereum. Most of those have a basket of value behind them for someone to feel comfortable with. So there's a fiat currency. So if you're talking about a stable coin, you're pegging that to a US dollar. And then if you're talking about maybe Diem, which is the rebranded Libra, their concept was a basket of currencies. And then they got big time pushback. And okay, maybe we tie it to individual currencies in different countries. And so, I'm not sure where it's going to end up, but it's here and it's getting some big time endorsements and it's going to continue to grow. And that's a long-term upheaval in the industry. It's not happening overnight, but it's happening.
Got it. What other headwinds do you see here in the banking industry today? Anything else that keeps you up at night today?
Well, since I'm not running a bank, it's not keeping me up. It's keeping all my members up. But yeah, there's a lot out there. I mean, some of the banks right now are struggling with, it's always politics. And so if you think about what happened earlier in the year with the pandemic, the industry was asked to step up and help with this payment protection program, the PPP. And so they did. They stepped up big time, and they might have approved 5.2 million in loans and put out 525 billion in loans to help small businesses. And with that, their balance sheets ballooned. And so now some of these smaller banks have less capital ratios. And today the government's saying, okay, we gave you a short-term pass with these capital ratios. Now we're going to take that pass away. And so that keeps a lot of bankers up because they were asked to step up and they did. And then the rug kind of gets pulled out from under them a little bit with respect to their balance sheet expanding just because they were the ones to step up and play. So that's a problem. I think commercial real estate could potentially be a problem. We have all these remote workers today. So what happens to all these buildings? Are people going to be downsizing? Does the value of commercial real estate drop? Are people looking to sublet their spaces? And so there could be some future losses for real estate lenders out there. And so there's just a lot of, I think, long-term ramifications to this economic tail associated with the pandemic that still haven't played out. All the bankruptcies haven't played out. How much stimulation will we continue to provide? So far, the industry's done pretty well because the government's pretty much paying the borrowers. It's creating all these trillions of dollars of debt to put into the hands of small business. And so in theory, that's keeping bank loans current to some degree. So I'm not sure how it's going to play out, but I think the biggest headwind is the margins. And then after that, I think technology is huge. And then that question of what's going to be regulated, what's going to be unregulated. So if you have a bunch of competitors that aren't on the same playing field as you are and they're not regulated, then they're going to continue to eat into the bank's profitability down the road.
Does the large banks or the international bank, do they factor in terms of how a smaller local community bank? I know that local banks and community banks have usually held their own throughout all this competitive and regulatory upheaval and landscape. Any thoughts there? And we're coming up on time, so I just have one more question after this.
Yeah, so I think that big banks, their margins are down around 200 basis points. Community banks are 400, high threes. A few lucky might be high fours. They have to find a niche and be really good at it. And their niche historically has been commercial real estate. They also have to offer all the same bells and whistles of everybody else. People are banking off their phones. It's mobile, and if they don't keep up, they're a casualty. And so the challenge is heavy for them. They have all the same regulations, but not all the resources to address them. So it's a tough business. And then the big banks, they just have to keep delivering cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And they suffer from margin compression too, but they make money outside of just loan to deposits. They make it in currency, trading. They're financial service companies. They're not just banks.
Got it. And that has sometimes caused a lot of challenges in the past, but that's a topic for another day. Where's the silver lining as we any thoughts, any positive events in the recent past that kind of are points to note there? So we have these headwinds. We're going to be careful about it. We'll be aware of it. But what are the tailwinds? Where's the silver lining here?
Well, I think eventually, community banks will always exist. Regional banks will always exist. The question is in how many numbers. I think what's going to happen is you're going to see more legislation around some of the competitors that don't see that today. So out here in California, they rebranded their Department of Business Oversight to deal with innovation. And they're trying to get their arms around some of the newly capitalized fintech companies. And then you're seeing almost fights between different regulatory bodies. Should we be extending limited charters to payment companies, or should we make them do all the things that banks do? And so, there's some broad mega trends that are out there facing the industry. It's still a great time to be a banker. I mean, it's a fun industry. It's changing in front of our eyes as we sit here. And so why not have a good time and enjoy all of that? I enjoy the industry. It does a ton of good work. It does a ton for communities. It gives back a lot. And so it's even though there's difficulty, there's always a silver lining in every industry. You just need to be nimble and flexible and change with the times.
That's great. On that note, thank you again, Steve Andrews. We just finished Dojo Live, sponsored by Ancora, with Steve Andrews, the president and CEO of the Western Bankers Association. Just hang on there, Steve, while we go off the air.
Just real quick before we do that, I want to remind everyone we have another show today at 12 noon Pacific. We're going to have Sam Brenner of Boxcast. See you back at noon.